In the spring of 1971, a woman named Edith Caro sat in a nursing home in upstate New York and agreed to be recorded for the first and only time. She was 91 years old. The young historian who held the microphone expected the usual things: stories of long winters, of horse-drawn wagons, of a century that had slipped away. Instead, Edith spoke for almost 2 hours about a single patient she had cared for as a girl, a patient she called only the giant child. She said the boy had been born in 1880, that he had grown to a height no doctor could explain, and that he remembered things he could not possibly have lived through. She said he spoke of cities that were not on any map. She said he described buildings of red stone that hummed, and streets lit without fire, and a great mud flood that had buried the old world while everyone was made to forget. And then, near the end of the recording, Edith Caro lowered her voice and said the sentence that has troubled every researcher who has heard the tape since. She said he was not confused. He was the last one who still remembered. Before we go any further into this, if you find these forgotten corners of history as fascinating as I do, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tap the like button. It genuinely helps these stories reach the people who are still curious enough to ask the questions that the textbooks quietly skipped. Now, let us return to the boy, and to the nurse who never stopped thinking about him. The official record of the child is thin, and that thinness is itself the first mystery. He appears in a county ledger in 1880 under a name that was later struck through and rewritten. He appears again in a hospital intake form in 1889, where his height at 9 years old is listed at a figure the clerk underlined twice, as if he did not trust his own pen. After that, the paper trail scatters. There are no school records. There is no census entry that matches. For a child who, by every account, towered over grown men by the time he was 12, the giant child of 1880 left almost nothing behind. It is as though the world around him was busy closing a door, and he was simply too large to fit through it quietly. Edith Caro came into his life in 1896. She was 16, a junior attendant at a private convalescent home, and the boy was placed in a wing that the senior staff did not discuss. She described her first sight of him carefully. She said he was sitting on a reinforced bed, knees nearly at the level of his chest, reading a book held open in one enormous hand. She said he looked up at her with what she called an old patience, the look of someone who has already explained himself many times and expects to do it again. He asked her name. When she gave it, he repeated it back slowly, and then he said something she never forgot. He said, "Edith is a good name. It was a common name in the cities before the change. The cities before the change." This is the thread that runs through everything Edith reported, and it is the thread that connects the boy to a much larger and stranger conversation that has grown quietly in the years since. Because the boy did not describe his memories the way a child describes a dream. He described them the way an old man describes a hometown. He spoke of an empire that had covered far more of the world than the maps allowed, an empire of shared architecture and shared knowledge, with buildings that were not built so much as grown, raised in a single generation by methods the new century had no words for. He called it by a name Edith spelled out phonetically on the tape, because she had never seen it written. The name was close to a word that researchers of forbidden history would recognize at once. It was close to Tartaria. Now, the conventional account is simple, and it deserves to be stated plainly. Mainstream historians hold that Tartaria was never an empire at all. They explain that for centuries, European mapmakers used the word Tartary as a loose label for the vast, poorly surveyed interior of Asia, a catch-all for lands they had not measured and peoples they did not know. In this view, there was no single civilization, no lost technology, no buried golden age. There was only a gap in knowledge that old cartographers filled with a single convenient word, and that word was later mistaken by modern eyes for the name of a nation. It is a careful explanation, and it accounts for a great deal, but it does not account for Edith Caro, and it does not account for what the boy said next. He told her that the great buildings of the old world were not monuments, they were instruments. He said the domes and the towers and the long ornamented halls had a purpose beyond shelter and beyond worship, that they were tuned the way an instrument is tuned, and that a city built correctly would hum so low that you felt it in your teeth before you heard it. He told Edith that the new century was tearing these instruments down and calling them too expensive to keep, too old, too strange. And he said the strangest thing of all. He said the buildings were not being demolished because they were useless. They were being demolished because they still worked, and because someone had decided the world should forget what they were for. Edith admitted on the tape that she did not believe him at first. She was 16, practical, raised in a household where strange talk was discouraged. But she said the boy never argued and never pleaded. He simply remembered calmly and consistently for the 2 years she knew him. And the consistency was what eroded her doubt. A child who invents will contradict himself. The boy never did. He described the same red stone, the same flooded streets, the same slow burial of an entire civilization under what he called the mud, year after year, in the same patient voice. She said that toward the end she stopped thinking of him as a sick child with delusions. She started thinking of him as a witness who had outlived everyone who could confirm his testimony. The mud is the detail that modern researchers seize upon, and it is worth pausing on. Across the world there are buildings, especially grand old buildings in old cities, whose ground floors sit oddly below street level, whose windows are half swallowed by the earth, whose elegant doorways now open onto basements. The standard explanation is ordinary and well documented. Cities rise over time. Streets are repaved again and again. Rubble accumulates. Ground levels creep upward over centuries. And what was once a front door slowly becomes a cellar. Engineers and archaeologists see this everywhere, and they see nothing mysterious in it. It is one of the most ordinary facts of urban life, repeated in every old city on earth, and no honest account of the boy's story should pretend otherwise. But the boy, in 1897, described it differently. He said the old world had not slowly risen. He said it had been buried quickly by a flood that carried earth instead of water, and that the survivors had been resettled, renamed, and told a gentler story to keep them calm. He told Edith that the men who came afterward did not lie loudly. They lied softly. They simply rebuilt the schoolrooms, printed new books, drew new maps, and waited for one generation to grow old and the next to grow up never having known the difference. He said forgetting was not an accident that happened to a people. He said it was a thing that could be done to them slowly and kindly by patient hands. It is important to be honest here. There is no physical proof that the boy was anything other than an unusually intelligent, unusually large child with a vivid inner life and a gift for sustained invention. Giantism is a real medical condition, and in the 1800s it was poorly understood and often hidden away in exactly the kind of quiet private wing where Edith found him. A lonely, isolated, well-read boy, kept apart from other children, may well construct an elaborate world and inhabit it for years. That explanation is reasonable. It asks us to believe only in loneliness and imagination, and both of those are common. We should also remember that the 1890s were a time when stories of lost civilizations filled cheap magazines and adventure novels, and a clever child with access to a small library could have gathered the pieces of his world from ordinary pages and stitched them into something that felt, to him, entirely real. The mind of a gifted and isolated boy is a powerful workshop, and it does not need a buried empire to produce one. The harder question is not whether that explanation is possible. It is whether it is sufficient, and Edith Caro, who knew the boy and watched him and listened to him for 2 years, did not think it was sufficient. She had read those same magazines. She knew what an invented story sounded like, the way it grew grander each time it was told, the way the teller watched your face to see if you believed. She said the boy did none of that. His world never grew. It only stayed the same, worn smooth like a memory rather than a dream. What finally convinced her was not a story. It was a map. She described it near the middle of the recording, and her voice changed when she did. She said that one afternoon the boy asked her for paper, and she brought him a sheet, and he drew. He drew slowly, with the concentration of someone copying rather than inventing. He drew a coastline. He drew a network of cities connected by straight lines he called the old roads. Roads, he said, ran beneath the new ones, and he labelled them in a careful hand with names. Edith kept that sheet of paper for the rest of her life. She said that as an adult she had compared it, quietly, to old maps in libraries, and she said that several of the names the boy had written, names no 9-year-old in upstate New York should have known, appeared on charts printed long before he was born, charts of the very region the textbooks now insisted had never been an empire at all. The young historian who recorded Edith in 1971 asked the obvious question. He asked whether he could see the map. He admitted later that his hands were not quite steady as he asked it, because for the first time in his career he felt that he was not interviewing the past but standing at its open door. And here the story takes its final turn. Edith said the map was gone. She said that after the boy died, quietly, in the winter of 1898, a man came to the convalescent home. Not a relative, not a doctor anyone recognized. He spoke with the senior staff, he collected the boy's few possessions, and he asked specifically and by name for any papers the boy had drawn. Edith, then 18, had already hidden the map in the lining of her own trunk. She said she did not know why she hid it. She said only that the boy had once told her that the last thing they always take is the map, because a people who cannot picture the old world cannot miss it. Edith kept that promise for 73 years. And then, on the tape, she said the map had finally been lost, not to any official, but to an ordinary house fire in 1964, along with most of what she owned. She laughed softly when she said it, the historian noted, a tired laugh that carried 70 years inside it. She said it was almost funny. She guarded it from the men who wanted it, carried it through 3 moves and 2 marriages and a long working life, and in the end the fire took it anyway, in a single ordinary night, as if the old world simply refused to be remembered. So we are left with the tape, and the tape is all we have. We cannot test the boy's memories. We cannot examine his impossible height except through a clerk's underlined figure. We cannot hold the map. We can only listen to a 91-year-old woman near the end of her life telling the truth as she understood it about a patient she had loved and never explained. And the conventional historians are right to remind us that memory is fragile, that the elderly misremember, that a lonely boy can invent a world, that maps can be misread, and that the word Tartaria most likely meant nothing more than the unmapped distance. Each of those cautions is fair. Each of them should be held in mind, but here is what the cautions do not dissolve. Edith Caro had nothing to gain. She sought no audience and accepted no payment. She did not contact the historian. He found her by chance while researching something else entirely, and she agreed to speak only once. She named no grand conspiracy and asked no one to believe her. She simply described in steady and specific detail a child who remembered a world that the rest of us were taught had never existed, and who insisted gently and to the end that the forgetting had been done on purpose. Perhaps the boy was only a boy. Perhaps the giant child of 1880 was a sick and brilliant and desperately lonely person who built a country in his mind because the real one had no room for him. That may be the whole truth, and if it is a sad and human truth worth honouring on its own. But somewhere in a lost county ledger there is a name that was struck through and rewritten. Somewhere there was a height a clerk did not trust his own pen to record. Somewhere a man with no name came asking specifically for a map. And somewhere on a recording that still exists, an old nurse who had no reason to lie said the words that we cannot quite put down. She said he was not confused. She said he was the last one who still remembered. And she said that the most dangerous thing about the old world was never its towers or its roads or its humming red stone. The most dangerous thing about the old world was simply that someone somewhere had remembered it at all.